It's hard to remember because it seems so long ago, but we began this year, 2020, on the brink of an international conflict, and it seems like we might end the year in a similar conflict. According to Iran's defense ministry yesterday, the country's top nuclear scientist was assassinated in his car in Tehran in broad daylight. For years, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was tasked with running Iran's infamous nuclear program. It was the same program that was restricted by the Iran nuclear deal. To us here in the U.S., this assassination may not seem like big news, but Fakhrizadeh's death is likely another event that will escalate tensions between Iran and its adversaries, including the United States. Over the last 4 years, the Trump administration's policies toward Iran have consistently led us to the precipice of conflict. And just days before this killing, news reports indicated that Trump may decide to strike Iran in the final days of his presidency, a move that could not only lead to regional catastrophe, but one that could effectively shut down the possibility of any diplomacy between Iran and the incoming administration. I'm joined now by Ali Arouzi. He is the Tehran bureau chief for MSNBC. Ali, what's the latest in this?
Well, Ali, today Iran's supreme leader, the man that holds all the cards in this country, called for revenge for the killing of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the mastermind of Iran's nuclear program and architect of its missile and defensive capabilities. Now, Ayatollah Khamenei said that Iran's first priority after the killing was the definitive punishment of the perpetrators and those who ordered it. Now, he didn't elaborate on who was to blame, but as you know, yesterday Iran's foreign minister said that the assassination of this nuclear scientist bore all the hallmarks of an Israeli operation. And we know only too well that Fakhrizadeh was firmly on Israel's radar. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had given a presentation in 2018 warning about the dangers of Iran's nuclear program and identified Fakhrizadeh, telling the audience to remember that name. That in itself has raised serious questions here about the breach of security and Iran's inability to protect its most valuable assets. Now, Ali, along with all the top military brass in Iran, the country's president today also expressed fury and vowed revenge for the assassination, but with a caveat. He said it has to be done at the proper time, and I think that's the most pressing consideration for the powers that be here. These hits are an embarrassment for Iran. If they don't counter, they risk looking weak and vulnerable, susceptible to more attacks. However, if they do strike back, they risk closing the door on the nuclear deal and triggering a possible all-out reprisal, which could be devastating to Iran. So, trying to figure out the next move here is like trying to herd cats, but from where I'm standing, the country is being weakened both politically and financially. They've lost key figures, and they're eager to get sanctions removed. Now, they may say that there's no difference between the outgoing and incoming administration, but I think they're going to be careful not to push the envelope too far with Joe Biden, initially anyway.
And the fact is that the rest of the world thinks there is a distinction between the outgoing and the incoming administration with respect to the Iran deal. John Kerry going to be playing a part in this incoming administration. He was responsible, along with Iran's foreign minister Javad Zarif, in making the Iran nuclear deal. There is some sense that the new American administration will be more sympathetic toward getting Iran back into the international fold than the Trump administration has. You're just saying that that's not widely trumpeted inside the Iranian administration.
Definitely, it's not widely trumpeted, but I think scratch the surface, and there is a sigh of relief that Joe Biden is coming in. They don't want to admit it. They want to say it doesn't matter who the occupant of the White House is. Policy towards Iran is always going to be hostile. That's something they have to say. Their raison d'etre is anti-Americanism. They don't want to be seen as being too eager to get back into a deal with them. But these guys that are still in power in Iran for the next 4 or 5 months, Rouhani, Zarif, who negotiated a deal, have a relationship with Joe Biden. Zarif, when he was the UN ambassador in the early 2000s, had met with Joe Biden many times when he was the head of the Foreign Relations Committee. They know each other. Their people did deals with each other. So it would be kind of hard to imagine that the current leadership in Iran isn't going to be a little more more relieved that they don't have to deal with President Trump. But with all of that said, this is still going to be infinitely complicated. It's hard to overstate the level of mistrust between these two, and this latest hit is going to make things even more tricky to navigate.
Ali Arouzi, my friend, thank you for joining us evening your time in Tehran. Ali Arouzi is MSNBC's Tehran bureau chief. It's becoming increasingly clear that the president can do a ton of damage in his remaining time in office, but can the country manage to avoid diving headfirst into a new conflict in the next 53 days? For more on this, I want to bring in Michael McFaul. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Russia and an MSNBC international affairs analyst. Michael, I was saying to Nicole Hannah-Jones earlier that lots of people voted for Joe Biden for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that Joe Biden wants to get America back into something of a leadership position in the world, and one in which it is not in an adversarial relationship with either Iran or North Korea or necessarily China or Russia, but that these relationships are more constructive. It doesn't seem like that's the administration Donald Trump wants to hand over to Joe Biden.
Well, that's for sure. Obviously, they have not been practicing diplomacy as a way to meet our core security objectives with all of those countries that you just mentioned. And I want to be clear, I do not support assassination as a tool of foreign policy. I don't know who did this. I want to be clear about that. But it's immoral. Number two, it leads to tit-for-tat reactions. And number three, it doesn't achieve any long-term objective. The idea that one person has some scientific knowledge that other doesn't, that's just not true. So I think this is a big mistake, whoever did it. But to your point, Ollie, yes, they're inheriting a mess around the world, not only with our adversaries that you just outlined, the competitive countries, but also with our allies. We have neglected our allies in Europe, in Asia, and it looks like the Trump administration wants to keep putting things in the way right before they hand over power.
We have a number of nominees to positions that many of our viewers may not be familiar with. Maybe they are if they're real politicos, but you probably are familiar with Tony Blinken as the nominee for the Secretary of State.
So to me, this is the $64,000 question. Is Donald Trump truly an ally to the United States people? Or is Donald Trump an actual adversary? Because if he don't want to hand over power, and if he don't want to do things the way that things is supposed to be properly done, what is Donald Trump actually trying to achieve? You know, he's done already spoke volumes about his brand. Well, I was under the interpretation that whenever you go into public office, whatever brand that you once stood for, it doesn't matter if you was supporting a local factory, or if you had your own personal businesses in the auto body industry or the electrical grid industry or the oil industry. Just look at Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney did not accomplish his own brand until Dick Cheney become vice president, and into about halfway into his administration, Halliburton become his brand. Today, that's what Dick Cheney is known by. Oil producing Halliburton. That's his brand. Donald Trump already had a brand pertaining to the Trumps. All this stuff about TV and all this other stuff. So now we're finding out that Donald Trump is more concerned about his brand in leaving office than he is the actual office. So you have to ask yourself the $64,000 question: is Donald Trump an ally to the United States people? Or is Donald Trump an adversary to the United States people as far as being the leader of the free world?
Mayorkas for Homeland Security, John Kerry, the Special Envoy for Climate, obviously someone you've worked with, Avril Haines for National Intelligence, Jake Sullivan as the incoming National Security Advisor. We don't have a nominee yet for defense, but there are a few key names being floated. How are you feeling about this group as it relates to national security and diplomacy for the next 4 years?
Well, I think it's a fantastic lineup so far. Several of them I know personally. Some of them, Tony Blinken, I've known for decades. Jake Sullivan, I worked very closely with when I worked at the White House in the Obama administration. And remember, he was part of the team, along with Ambassador Bill Burns, who led the secret negotiations with the Iranians in the beginning. Later, Secretary Kerry took over, and Undersecretary Wendy Sherman, our colleague here at MSNBC. But initially, it was Jake that did that opened up those negotiations. And Avril Haines, first class, Secretary Kerry, who I obviously worked with when I was ambassador to Moscow. I would say a couple of things. Very competent people, very experienced people, hardworking people who are going to get up every morning to advance America's national interests. They're not going to have any doubts about that oath of office that you read earlier. And there are going to be policy differences. People will have differences of policy positions with President Biden, with Vice President Harris, and with this team, but you're not going to have disagreements about their competency. I think competency is going to come back.
What are we looking at in terms of leadership? Joe Biden's talked about this. Many Americans sort of say it. America, regaining a leadership role in America. Where are the pockets of opportunity for us to demonstrate that? We know rejoining the climate accord helps, but I wouldn't call that leadership. That gets us back to where we were when Donald Trump pulled us out. Where do we show leadership in an unstable world right now?
Well, I think you're asking a very complicated question, actually, because there's no resetting to go back to, 2016. The world has moved on. There's been a lot of change in the last 4 years. And most, of course, there's a sigh of relief around the world, at least people I know, that President-elect Biden will take over in January. He is a noted internationalist, number one. He cares about values, number two. That was something that President Trump has never talked about. Democracy, human rights, rule of law, promoting those ideals abroad, he's given no attention to. So just having Biden, and then Biden's incredibly experienced. Don't forget that. He's been working on foreign policy for decades. Having said all that, they are inheriting a world that is more suspicious of American power, that is worried that we're polarized. And guess what? They're right. We're not going to be able to just step in and lead the free world again. We're going to have to prove that we can own that and do that more effectively. I think the easy things to do first and foremost are with our allies. I think shoring up NATO, shoring up our alliances in Asia, that is where people want leadership. But how to deal with the great powers that you mentioned in the beginning, how to deal more effectively and pragmatically with China and Russia in particular, and then how to deal with non-proliferation issues with North Korea and Iran, that's not going to be easy. And I think it's harder today than it was 4 years ago. Iran has more nuclear capability today than 4 years ago. North Korea has more capability than they did 4 years ago. China's more powerful today than they were 4 years ago. And that's going to be very challenging for the new Biden administration coming in.
Well, you said it was a complicated question, but you gave a very fulsome answer to it, one that suggests that you and I are going to have many, many more talks about this over the next few years. There is work to be done. Thank you, sir. Mike McFaul is the former United States ambassador to Russia and someone upon whom I frequently rely for this sort of analysis. Well, 13 million cases and counting. Unlike Americans, the coronavirus pandemic did not take time off for the holiday. Coming up next, I'm going to talk with a member of the Biden-Harris COVID Advisory Board who predicts that hospitals will be even more slammed come Christmas and New Year's. Keep it locked. You're watching MSNBC.
Sad.
Let's see what you got, Oculus.
Very sad.
Cool.